Despite what the internet may think, this experiment wasn't born out of hatred for survivors or overall malicious intent. Instead, this was born out of genuine curiosity and the fact that the meta tides in DBD are changing, but not necessarily for the better. Fair warning, there is a lot to go over, so I will have included timestamps above and in the comment section for those with short attention spans to be able to click through. Over the years within Dead by Daylight, we've seen different metas curated by behavior, whether it was intentional or not. As they buffed or nerfed killers or buffed or nerfed perks, the ebbs and flows of gameplay have been something that most players have had to adapt to. One thing I've personally noticed, however, is that the time sink for killers seems to have been gapped by the amount of time survivors are given in-game, which can be noted as a good or a bad thing. The majority of our player base plays DBD as a solo team member or in a duo group, leading to a lot of mishaps that behavior has done a relatively good job at trying to close the gap of, either with the inclusion of the activity HUD or the overall buffs to perks that allow survivors to be more self-sufficient. It does show that they are trying to do some good as a development company to help those that most need it in the form of our solo queue warriors. However, this time and energy has to be taken from a different source, leaving many killers, especially those on the lower tier end, to pick up the pieces and scratch whatever extra time in-game they can from what's being taken from them. The most recent and notable change being that the hook timers were increased by 10 seconds with patch notes 8.2. This is one of the more controversial takes of the year, and to those who only play Survivor, it may not seem like a big one, but from competitive players to public players, this feels like a damning blow. While the intent of helping those left to struggle because of poor performance or fumbled priorities seems like a positive one, killer mains across multiple skills and platforms feel as if they're being left in the dust by poor dev decisions, especially because this change was one that seemed relatively unwarranted or requested. If we consider the time sink for killers, between the average chase time to down a survivor, checking if the area is clear from a flashlight save or a pallet save, reloading weapons, walking over to a hook, multiplied by 12 hook stages, a lot of time is lost for killers. When you factor in the benefits of hooking, killers have 27 perks that they can gain benefits from when hooking, while survivors have 29 perks to benefit from once being hooked, and an additional 25 perks for resetting or healing once being injured. On top of this interaction, certain builds and perk stacking make survivors particularly obnoxious to deal with when attempting to hook the downed survivor, like the combination of either stackable sabo perks like Breakout or the lone existence of background player. Not to mention, after being unhooked, survivors can become little mini anti-tunneling gods, tanking hell state after hell state with several different second chance perks, which would be an issue if you were actively tunneling. But if you're trying to avoid said survivor, you end up dealing with a bottlenecked, freshly healed survivor taking chase, tanking a hell state into an endurance hit, into decisive strike, into a dead hard, which begs the question, what if we ignore this interaction altogether? While this experiment initially was going to be a small 1 to 2 person pool of data, I figured this wouldn't be sufficient enough evidence to support my claim, or to gain a better understanding on if ignoring hooking survivors would work better in today's meta than following the standard objective. I reached out to killer mains from all walks of Earth with my experiment, simply play 20 games of DBD, 10 normal, and 10 games where they couldn't hook any survivors till all 4 were on the floor, forcing survivors to reorganize their priorities since the killers weren't typically playing as expected, as well as seeing if this general playstyle would outperform and counteract the majority of survivor builds. When you consider survivor builds, of the top 20 used perks from Nightlight, only one perk really sticks out as an anti-slugging perk, while for killer, 7 of the top 20 used perks have to do with a hooking interaction. I figured this left the slugging playstyle wide open to be taken advantage of since survivors are currently unprepared to handle it more often than not. With the majority of hooking perks not providing much substance in game, changing the build didn't cause too much of a fuss for the majority of the killers. While Pop and Pain Res are the most popular aggression perks to run, the majority of the killers in the game are also able to take advantage of Jolt. However, the builds were split between either going for a build that benefited slugging, such as Third Seal or Knockout, versus just an overall complementary build for the killer with a regression perk that synergized well with the killer, or just foregoing everything completely. The only killers I did not get to account for in this experiment were Ghostface, Demogorgon, and Twins. So I do apologize to those who main those killers, as I cannot find an adequate main to fulfill the request in the time frame given. Before following the scientific method, my personal hypothesis is as follows. Slugging games would outperform the hooking games not only in time frame, but in the amount of builds that would be negated would also be more than the hooking games. I do acknowledge that certain killers' playstyles are naturally geared towards slugging, as is the case with Oni, Plague, Myers, or Twins, as well as killers that already ignore hook states such as Pyramid Head, and these would generally be outliers in the experiment. But I wanted to have as much included in my data as I could. Killers were tasked with not only tracking their win rate, but the maps that they played on, the length of their matches, the amount of salt that they witnessed, the amount of DCs that occurred, as well as what the survivor builds contained, whether they had anti-tunneling perks, anti-slugging perks, sabo builds, non-meta or meta builds, and finally, the amount of gens that were completed. When we compared the results of the experiment, despite my initial hypothesis, I was quite surprised with how well slugging did overall. Slugging matches were overall shorter, more effective, and resulted in less gen completion for killers. On average, survivors completed 1.91 gens when the killers went for a slugging playstyle, while when hooking as normal, survivors completed 2.6. Now, this does account for all of the killers, from S to D tier, but to have almost double the average is surprising. Out of the 710 games that were played, when it came to slugging, they had almost a fourth of their games where no gens were completed, with another quarter accounting for only one gen being completed. When it came time for endgame, only 14% of the games for slugging came to that point, while 20% of the games for hooking ended up with all of the gens being completed. However, one thing was noted with this experiment is that the gates were more likely to be open for the slugging game when the exit gates were powered versus the hooking game, most likely due to the more every man for himself nature of endgame. The games that did make it to endgame were reported to be a little bit more frustrating than hooking, as the defense was a bit weaker and harder to secure than if someone were on a hook. So, gens were definitely on the downturn with slugging, but if coordinated teams were able to make it to endgame, they had a much better escape rate than their slugged counterparts. When it came to the win rate, we're getting a 4K as the win condition. 85% of games were won when slugging, while only 75% of games were won when hooking. Securing a 4K was overall reportedly much easier because all survivors were accounted for once they were on the ground. With the new finisher Mori system, which was introduced after all the data was submitted, you no longer have to worry about one survivor's Kobe potential, instead being able to secure the 4K that much quicker. As an outlier within the experiment, the nurse had a reportedly lower win rate mainly because the left survivor often ended up baiting their team for hatch, resulting in significantly more 3Ks on hook than the amount of 4Ks for the slugging game. Since behavior's win con and overall focus in game is the kills being the most important aspect for the killer, especially with the inclusion of the final survivor Mori system, going for slugging over hooking resulted in a higher win percentage as well as shorter games. When we compare the overall kill rate for slugging versus hooking, 3% of games for slugging resulted in no kills versus 2% for the hooking games. 4% of games resulted in 1K versus 2% for hooking. 3% of games for slugging resulted in a 2K versus 6% for hooking. 3% of games for slugging resulted in a 3K versus 14% for hooking. And finally, 85% of games resulted in a 4K for slugging versus 74% for hooking. In regards to match length, on average, the slugging games were 5 to 10 minutes, while the hooking games were 10 to 15 minutes. The time sink of either worrying about flashlight saves, sabos, pallet saves, or just making it to your scourge hook was completely taken out of the equation with leaving survivors on the ground and patrolling the area while pressuring gens, showcasing an almost trap killer playstyle without having to worry about the anti-camp mechanic that would normally plague killers in this situation. While admittedly some of the lower tier killers did struggle with the slugging playstyle, the higher rated killers reported quicker games overall. When going over survivor reactions, one thing that was not surprising were the survivors being upset. Understandably, being slugged isn't always the preferred action, especially for survivors that are itching to go next. By keeping survivors slugged, they aren't given the easy way out, forcing them to decide whether they want to wait out the match on the floor, actually try to escape in the game, or DC and wait out the penalty. One of the biggest frustrations in the game right now is the fact that survivors seem to be so often giving up on the first hook, especially if the chases don't go as planned or if it's a killer they don't like to go against. By keeping the survivors in game by slugging and not giving them the easy way out, the DC percentage did rise to almost double. At least one DC occurred in 40% of matches when slugging versus 19% of matches when hooking, as well as the salt percentage, where salt occurred in 37% of matches versus 20% when hooking. As someone who does play survivor, I do acknowledge that this isn't the most fun playstyle to go against, but I also want to acknowledge the changing tides for killers to see if there's actually a more preferable way to complete the objective with the constantly changing meta and evolving playstyles. As mentioned earlier, the majority of the meta when it comes to survivors stem from second chance perks, healing perks, or exhaustion perks, leaving them unprepared and uncoordinated when it came to the slugging experiment. Builds were split into 6 sections, containing either anti-tunnel perks like DS or Off the Record, anti-slugging perks like Exponential or Unbreakable, a mix of tunneling and slugging perks, containing a Sabo build, a build that had none of the above but is mostly meta, and finally a build that had none of the above and contained no meta. Anti-tunneling perks accounted for 865 builds across 2,840 survivors, totaling 30% of builds in-game. Anti-slugging perks had a significantly less percentage of 220 survivors, or 7% of builds. As expected, the majority of survivors ran meta builds containing exhaustion or gen completion perks, but because there were so few slugging perks, it left the playstyle wide open. Saboing was another factor that weighed in with the initial hypothesis, but it ended up having a lower percentage than expected, accounting for 78 survivors, or 2.74% of builds. Regarding the anti-tunneling portion of builds, when the slugging matches commenced and the hooking matches started, there was a significant uptick in frustration when it came to dealing with the amount of anti-tunneling perks that the survivors were running. Despite 1/4 of survivors running anti-tunneling perks, oftentimes those survivors were the most annoying to deal with, with many killers reporting having DS and off-the-record weaponized against them, and having to deal with the anti-tunneling perks, even when they weren't tunneling. Many killers reported feeling less frustration in their slugging matches for this reasoning. The minimal anti-slug perks did pose issues in a few games, especially on the maps where there was a hidden exponential that was difficult to find, or in a few matches where Soul Guard came into play against the killer's hex perks. Finally, another big factor in gameplay is what maps the killers were sent to, either by survivor map offerings or by RNG. Maps in this game are another frustrating factor in my opinion, as for certain killers, it can often mean the game's over before it begins. Behavior doesn't do the best in map prioritization or balancing in my opinion, but maps that the killers played on were diverse enough that we were able to pool a significant amount of data to compare the matches to. I'll do the win percentage for the most common maps that were revealed, as well as the best maps for slugging and the best maps for hooking. There were several maps where the slugging games had a 100% win rate, but the comparison to hooking matches didn't provide sufficient enough evidence in my opinion, as is the cases for Coal Tower, Cowshed, Dead Dog, Pale Rose, Temple, and Wreckers, where those maps had a 100% win rate for slugging, but the amount of matches played between slugging and hooking was too high of a variance. For example, Dead Dog had a 100% win rate, but it was only across 3 matches, where hooking had a 24% win rate across 17 matches. So I didn't feel like it was the best comparison. Only one map in the realm was completely even, which was Ironworks, where both playstyles had 8 matches each on the map, and both resulted in an 87% win rate. The most popular maps in the experiment were Ormond, RPD, Meat Plant, Preschool, and Garden of Joy. For Ormond, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had an 82% win rate. For RPD, slugging had a 100% win rate, while hooking had a 61% win rate. For Meat Plant, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 76% win rate. For Preschool, slugging had a 93% win rate, and hooking had a 71% win rate. And for Garden of Joy, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 28% win rate. The best maps for slugging were RPD, Midwich, Preschool, Meat Plant, and Garden of Joy. For slugging, they had a 100% win rate for RPD, while hooking had a 71% win rate. For Midwich, slugging had a 92% win rate, and hooking had a 55% win rate. For the Preschool maps, slugging had a 93% win rate, and hooking had a 71% win rate. For Meat Plant, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 76% win rate. And for Garden of Joy, slugging had an 88% win rate, and hooking had a 28% win rate. The best maps for hooking were Disturbed Ward, Azarov's, Family Residence, Groaning Storehouse, and Forgotten Ruins. On Disturbed Ward, slugging had a 63% win rate, and hooking had a 100% win rate. For Azarov's, slugging had an 83% win rate, and hooking had a 100% win rate. For Family Residence, slugging had an 80% win rate, and hooking had a 100% win rate. For Groaning Storehouse, slugging had a 71% win rate, and hooking had a 100% win rate. And finally, for Forgotten Ruins, slugging had a 62% win rate, and hooking had a 92% win rate. I tried to choose a map pool variance that had close enough comparisons, but I will have the entire graphic shown to showcase all of the maps in-game. Torment Creek is another outlier, as it did not show up in any of the games for the killers while hooking. While I understand this was a lot to go over, I appreciate any sort of patience you had while I explain the results of the experiment. I also want to acknowledge some fallacies that could be brought up when arguing against this experiment. One, the match data pool could be too small, but I didn't feel comfortable asking a multitude of killers to play 50 to 100 matches and record every instance in every match in order for me to collect data. I figured 20 matches, 10 of which would be the experiment, and the other 10 would be control for comparison, would be an easy enough request, as many killers completed the experiment over the course of one stream or one play session. Another variable after this experiment was the recent changes in patches 8.3, most notably the changes to several healing perks for survivors such as We're Gonna Live Forever, which was completely unwarranted in my opinion, anti-tunneling perks such as Blood Rush, anti-healing perks like Leverage and Blood Echo, as well as hook perks like Dead Man Switch, which I'm still heartbroken over. It's a hard variable to see if after the patch settled, how often you'd come across these perks and if there would be a stark change in matches or meta. But I do see Wiglif posing an issue for matches, since it gives survivors bootleg fuckle up once again with a combination of Wiglif and Made for This, which is another complaint and story altogether. I also acknowledge the difference in hour set and MMR for the players. The hour range was 1.5k all the way up to I believe 13k. This is a huge variance to account for, and the experience that some of the players had in-game might tip the scales in their favor, as they'd be more likely to accommodate unsavory situations, builds, or maps that would be against the killer that they played. If I were ever to recreate it, I would like to see a beginner, intermediate, and experienced person do matches for each killer, to see the results that would align with the hour set that would reflect upon the more casual player base. And finally, the servers where this experiment was performed. The majority of the player base was in North America, but I understand that every server has their own preferences in regards to meta, playstyles, and how they feel about each killer. A player primarily playing on Japanese servers would most likely play a little bit differently or run a completely different build than someone who plays on European servers. Again, if it could be replicated to the extent that I mentioned, I would have done so. So for now, please understand that I wanted to get as much data as possible while not taking up too much time of players. While I don't necessarily think that this will result in a complete overhaul with the way that people play, it does showcase that you have more than the standard hooking option to follow when in game, especially in situations where you feel like the match is out of your hands. There have been a multitude of discussions lately where killer mains often feel like behavior is taking time away from them in game with the more recent hook timer buffs, reset buffs, healing buffs, anti-camp meter, and nerfs to the more popular regression perks that you would be able to utilize after hooking survivors. It's not that I necessarily want this meta to be preferred, but I think that there is an issue with the fact that the playstyle is more advantageous than the one in-game. This also isn't a call to buff anti-slug perks, but instead give better incentives in-game to killers in order to hook. I would also like to preface by saying that I have an equal amount of hours in both killer and survivor over the years that I've played DBD, so this is not a wholly killer-sided take. I'm mainly looking for incentives like Old Barbecue, where you were given a percentage of BP incentive for survivors hooked, or minute changes to pain res, as multiple matches have been stuck with poor spawns and terrible usage when I've had no choice but to lose a stack. However, the purpose of this video is merely to showcase and explain the data for the experiment, not necessarily provide solutions or fix any potential problems in game. The final section of this video is more of a statement from all of the killers as well as the slugging versus hooking dataset. While going over the killer data, I will try to be as concise as possible. But as mentioned earlier, I will include timestamps so that y'all can skip to your specific killer interest if you do not feel like hearing about every single killer. Those who participate in the experiment will have all of their information in the description box as well, so if you have any additional questions, they will be available to ask. Dracula is definitely one of the more interesting figures in the fog, as he has 3 different powers at hand to utilize in chase, and per our Dracula players, he also excelled greatly in the amount of pressure he put on survivors during the experiment. While not a single match was lost for our Dracula players, resulting in a perfect 4K rate of 100% across the board, the slugging matches were significantly quicker, with almost every match ending in less than 10 minutes, and almost half ending in less than 5 minutes. Per Scooty, playing a constant tug-of-war with survivors when slugging created a more fascinating gameplay loop, especially when there were survivors with anti-slug perks in place. Dracula was infinitely easier to slug with due to his add-on Medusa's Hair, since you could force a 15% hinder with relative ease. Overall, slugging was stated to be quicker and easier than the hooking counterpart. In contrast to Dracula, our Vecna main doesn't necessarily recommend slugging on their killer, as the win condition of a 4K was harder to achieve, especially because they weren't quite used to the playstyle. They did state that they do the occasional slugging, but the 4 on the floor was a rough fit for their main and had an overall feeling of frustration and was met with significantly more salt than their normal matches. However, the use of anti-tunnel perks was also more noticeable in their hooking matches, which is to be expected. The results were about the same when you compare the hooking stats to the slugging ones, so it may be a matter of comfortability that would be in effect, rather than how well suited the killer's power is to the playstyle. For the Unknown, with its flexible projectile and ability to snowball, the matches for the Unknown were significantly easier when it came to slugging versus hooking, where the overall annoyance came from the amount of DCs that occurred in the match instead of the playstyle's frustration. Between both mains, the Unknown had the ability to be all over the map at different points in the game, stalling any resets or pickups that would occur with the slugs. Indigo noted that the general frustration came from the gifted reset perks that came with the hooking games versus the slugging, but appreciated the lack of downtime for the slugging matches had for the killer. They stated, "It felt similar to how the 2v8 went when there was no downtime or need to hook anyone, and it felt more efficient and generally felt like the small aspects of her gameplay were improved." Both mains acknowledged that the slugging was easier than hooking, especially resulting in quicker matches, with one stating that they'd be more open to slugging for pressure because it allowed them to remove survivor pressure for free, while the other stated that they would be staying with the hooking gameplay loop, but definitely felt more confident with slugging and adjusting to survivors' playstyles to take advantage in that route. With Chucky's 110 speed, the lack of map pressure was the biggest downfall when it came to the slugging games, where his slugging matches being a feast or famine playstyle, either being incredibly profitable or negating his power and pressure completely. Unbreakable was seen, but not a huge factor. However, a well-placed exponential could kill the entire game. Instead of a full slug strategy, trying to go for one and then downing another, then hooking, would be easier to adapt to than the 4 on the floor. And Dead Hard was actually more frustrating to deal with than the majority of the anti-tunnel perks. But overall, slugging wasn't quite recommended, just more of a situational suggestion of the survivors leaning into it. Slugging is definitely viable on Chucky due to his quick downing capabilities and shorter cooldown, but since the speed is a huge hinder as being a 110 killer, it's not as easily taken advantage of than some of his 115 counterparts. With Xeno's tunnel system being built for macro play, for both survivor control and gen pressure, this killer's playstyle is naturally inclined more for hooking rather than slugging, and resulted in better matches overall. Coordinated teams were definitely a downfall more than others for this killer, and the lack of being able to hook and get survivors out of the game was frustrating for our Xeno. Like other killers, the more apart and ill-coordinated the survivors were, the easier it was to take advantage of the slugging playstyle, and like Chucky, the matches were either a complete breeze or incredibly stressful when trying to keep the survivors on the ground. Our Xeno stated that slugging and hooking would work well in combination of the Xeno's power, especially with the ability to get downs in quick succession on certain maps, but since you're able to apply constant map pressure as Xeno, slugging might feel more frustrating than hooking on this killer. Slugging was incredibly efficient on the Singularity, with only 3 gens being completed in a total of 10 games. While this playstyle is not recommended for newer Larry players, focusing on one slug to get pressure and trying to end chases relatively quickly blends well with his power and playstyle. According to Coco, Singularity is definitely one of the best killers for slugging, and the statistics showcase that. The only real trouble that came from slugging stemmed from the slugs crawling too far away once everyone was on the floor, causing survivors to bleed out unnecessarily. Once the slugging matches ended, the effects of DS, Off the Record, and Dead Hard were immediately noticeable, and the perks were much more prevalent in said games. Despite slugging being more efficient, hooking is still preferred due to comfortability, but if you wanted to take advantage of the slugging playstyle, Larry is definitely the best at the skill set. Since the character has a testy history with the general survivor base, despite the higher win rate on the Skull Merchant, slugging is not necessarily recommended for her abilities, especially due to her recent nerfs and changes made by behavior. Pixel's general reluctance was noted, but the higher salt rate and DC rate didn't equate to a more valuable gameplay experience, especially since being able to hook provides Skull Merchant with a wider variety of ability to get the survivors out of the game. Since the main skill ceiling for Skull Merchant relies on laser tagging and cutting down chases, being able to down survivors isn't more advantageous versus someone like Dracula or Twins. It was noted that the use of Off the Record was more frustrating to deal with once the hooking games continued, but overall, hooking was more beneficial than slugging in this case. Despite Knight's power having a bit of encouragement when it comes to slugging, the overall consensus was that hooking is still preferred, not for difficulty, but for the lack of enjoyment for the players. Games felt much longer when slugging as the Knight, and the lack of slug patrol for the guards made it a bit easier to reset against, versus having guards patrol the hook area where survivors are located. Slugging is encouraged a bit when it comes to the Knight, especially because guards are able to intercept any sort of flashlight or pallet save or salvo attempt from nearby survivors. Anti-tunnel was noted, especially with weaponized DS in the hooking matches, but Knights should be aware that the matches do feel longer with slugging, but you can be advantageous when needed. Opinions on whether or not slugging was more beneficial were actually split between the two mains, as Scooty preferred the slugging playstyle but acknowledged some minute difficulties, while Shader was not a fan, toting longer games overall and noted the definite frustrations that the survivors had when they went against the killer. The benefits with slugging from Wesker are definitely noted with his infection rate on survivors being reset once they're hooked. You're able to stall significantly more when slugging versus hooking, but it more so took advantage of bad or uncoordinated teams in most situations. The DC and salt rate were immensely lower on the hooking games, but Wesker's power does a really good job at hindering survivors' ability to reset themselves, so maybe more of a personal opinion since the division is split. Dredge is an excellent slugger, almost more so than Behavior's Intent, especially with the continuous buffs and pressure that Nightfall give the Dredge. While hooking presents more ability for slowdown usage, slugging was noted as the more aggressive playstyle for the Dredge and came with much higher benefits, but it definitely was not fun on the end for the survivors. A good chunk of the survivors ended up giving up during the Dredge's slugging games, as the combination of knockout paired with Nightfall left uncoordinated teams stumbling. Per gaming athlete, Dredge is incredible at slugging, but it definitely wasn't fun or fair for the survivors. Sadako used to be one of the undisputed queens of slugging, but Behavior has done a phenomenal job at taking away this playstyle from her. And despite the higher win rate on the slugging games, for the most part, slugging doesn't quite fit into her power and playstyle, since you're able to remove the tapes when hooking survivors, while slugging lets them keep it, helping survivors get rid of stacks that much easier. With Sadako, her power allows you to build immense pressure with survivors running around the map, and you get excellent map mobility while building condemns, and since slugs don't build condemn stacks, half of her power ends up being negated by this playstyle, so it is overall not recommended. Between Vez and I, there were notable differences in our games, especially with the reintroduction of anti-tunnel perks for our hooking games. Slugging allowed us to pull survivors off of gens and really force survivors to decide whether they were going to be altruistic or try to salvage gen progress when possible, and I definitely noticed the difference in pressure when survivors adopted an every man for themselves approach, instead of trying to help out their team or trying to reset with builds. As a competitive player, Vez's strategy preferred slugging to negate certain perks like Deliverance and to avoid the 70 to 100 seconds of a hook stage that survivors would have had to play around, making the playstyle effective in limiting second chance perks and denying self-fund perks that would give the survivors more time to try to escape the trial. As someone who prefers ore rating perks like barbecue, it was definitely a change of pace and was a playstyle that didn't allow me to go for more long-range shots, but it definitely was more effective. Slugging overall was much easier on Pinhead than other killers, resulting in quicker matches and a positive outcome. With the exception of Unbreakable and Exponential, the lack of anti-tunnel and second chance perks that were negated made matches a breeze. Pinhead's Chain Hunt also helped when it came to resetting, with healing being put to a standstill and the ability to know where survivors were to keep up the constant pressure. Slugging was incredibly strong on Pinhead, and it definitely made him one of the best killers for the playstyle. Despite the overall higher win rate on Nemesis, it was definitely a feast or famine type of gameplay, and was notably more frustrating for this killer's playstyle, and it definitely brought out the nastiness in the killer's games. Games went from focusing on chases to struggling to find slugs and proxying for pressure, and the negativity came from being more empathetic towards survivors, noticing that it wasn't necessarily the most fun playstyle to go against. Despite the win rate being better, as the Nemesis typically goes for 8 hooks before killing survivors, it wasn't the most adaptive and denied some of the aspects for pressure. Tunneling memes aside, denying resets and keeping survivors infected is an important part with keeping up as Nemesis, but you don't have much to gain with this playstyle, so it's definitely up to personal preference. With the inclusion of main event, Trickster excels in providing pressure in high volume areas and is able to take advantage of grouped up survivors and denying pickups with slugs. Trickster doesn't generate the best amount of map pressure from hooks, so slugging allows you to keep pressure on survivors and does well with punishing pickups and altruism. Main event keeps Trickster's uptime high, but can be in trouble due to his ammo dependency. The noticeable lack of anti-tunnel helps elevate his gameplay, and the longer hook times take time away from killers and allowing survivors to focus more on gens, and be stuck either trading or leaving the area. Rev does include slugging in his build and his playstyle normally, so the 4 on the floor requirement for the killer in this experiment was more comfortable than other killers, but the benefits are definitely undeniable with Trickster. Now, the results may be a bit skewed when it comes to Momo and his win rate, but Blight's mobility and overall prowess makes matches a breeze whether you're slugging or hooking. Match outcome wasn't necessarily affected by the killer, which is replicated among all of the S tier killers as we get to them. Playstyle will be more of a matter of preference versus what is advantageous, but Blight is definitely killed at keeping survivors on their toes and pressuring multiple downs in a condensed area. Pyramid Head is one of the killers in this experiment where I didn't anticipate that many benefits coming from it, because he's already an outlier in the game and the undisputed tunneling king. With his trail tormenting survivors and allowing him to bypass hooks completely, the results are kind of a given, as he's not necessarily having to deal with the downtime that most killers are experiencing. With his cages negating a lot of the anti-tunnel perks in the game by default, he's definitely a killer that'll be more of a personal preference than anything else. He doesn't have the best map mobility, but once you get familiar with cage spawns, you're able to use cages to your advantage, and quickly get survivors out of your game by design. Smaller maps were definitely a key in this playstyle when it came to slugging, but Pyramid Head is his own entity in the realm, and it really shows. Deathslinger was a killer where the slugging and hooking came at more of a neutral outcome, but slugging was more challenging and required a bit more focus due to the precise nature of Deathslinger and his 110 speed easily being punished. Per Osu, hooking is the way to go because you can use different types of pressure to advance the gameplay, whereas slugging was more reliant on taking advantage of altruistic survivors making poor mistakes against him. Being slower than the majority of the killers does negate his map mobility, but Deathslinger does excel in swapping and pressuring unhook, so it would be more of a matter of personal preference. Oni is the killer in the game that I like to call an opportunistic slugger, where downing and pressuring survivors in a condensed area is built into his power. But since slugs don't drop blood orbs, you're on a time crunch to take advantage of your power as much as possible, and slugging might not be the most beneficial. Slugging is innate with his power and as expected, but for the experiment, it wasn't necessarily more beneficial than the typical hooking playstyle. Slugging opportunistically is common for all killers, of course, but for Oni, since he wants survivors up and injured, it wasn't the most fun or made the most sense. Like Oni, Plague is an opportunistic slugger that relies on close-knit survivors making poor decisions. Plague is also a killer that works better as time goes on, and slugging early on in the match wasn't always the best play. Regular hooking works better, and like Oni, taking advantage of your power and being able to slug as needed. Plague does suffer a bit of a time sink like the majority of the killers, but with her normal map mobility and reliance on survivors making mistakes, it wasn't showcased to be that much more beneficial, but it did result in quicker matches, but not necessarily more fun ones. While the Legion can have excellent map mobility and the ability to pressure multiple survivors with their frenzy, Because Legion can't necessarily get a faster down than the other M1 killers, as long as everyone stays injured, the power can be negated a bit as long as survivors are also separated from each other. However, because slugging requires the survivors to be altruistic, Legion is able to take advantage of constant mending, and if enough survivors are in the same area, they can chain slugs upon pickup as needed. Both hooking and slugging is viable, but since Legion doesn't have the best reputation in the game, slugging can feel dirtier on this killer in particular, resulting in a higher salt rate, but also kept the games quicker with a higher 4K rate. As one of the best killers in the game, when she's not bugged, Spirit excels in being able to be lethal to altruistic survivors and is able to cut chases down into slivers with her phases. On top of this, she can be one of the best tunnelers in the game, with how quickly she can be right on top of survivors after being DS'd, and closing the distance you gain from being hit with off the record. Spirit was one of the killers where the overall match time was longer when it came to slugging, but it was mainly due to the slugs reaching the far corners of large maps and making it difficult to find them. Leaving survivors on the ground was more beneficial for the killer, as you didn't have to deal with as much of a time sink since Spirit is 110, and using phasing for distance isn't as recommended, so the extra time actually came from finding slugs rather than the actual overall chase time. Clown had an incredibly in-depth review, so I'll be pulling this section directly with quotes rather than restating from the post-experiment questionnaire. While there were times where slugging felt easier than conventional gameplay, I want to put a lot of emphasis on my belief that I think many Clown players will struggle if they attempt to recreate the same outcome. Much of my success was dependent on my vested understanding of how to play Clown and Chase. Those who struggle to use Clown's bottles effectively will enable survivors to either stall out healing resets or finish generators given the playstyle doesn't have any tools, including Corrupt, to stall out gen repair progress. Slugging as Clown is very feast or famine. You're either going to win or lose big. Conventional gameplay is at least more likely to result in middling outcomes where one at the very least might tie against the survivors. It is unlikely to tie when slugging due to the lack of generator slowdown tools in tandem with the Clown's lack of mobility for macro pressure. This being said, slugging does have its advantages. With the recent extension to hook timers, survivors have been capitalizing on the extra 10 seconds to achieve more repair progress with each hook state. This is especially punishing against Clown since he lacks map mobility tools and as a result may find himself needing to tunnel in more circumstances than before. In turn, the existence of anti-tunneling tools creates a lose-lose situation for Clown, given that he's punished for needing to make the right chase decisions due to the overall flow and state of the match. This loss of momentum from perks like DS, Off the Record, or even Dead Hard can completely remove the possibility that Clown can recover enough over the course of the match to get 3 or more kills. The main difference for Pig, besides changing the build, was actually focusing on a different add-on combination to synergize with his playstyle, as Pig is another killer that does well as the game progresses due to the bear trap mechanic putting pressure on survivors as they complete gens. Druss also mentioned that their games with Pig didn't actually have frustrations in the builds, but in RNG and map design ruining their gameplay. Pig is more opportunistic in the playstyle of trying to get to a 3v1 as fast as possible, or to get as many survivors trapped as possible, as their completing gens already gives you more time in game. But against coordinated survivors, the Pig already doesn't do well, and this was elevated more in the slugging games. Since you want survivors to complete gens and focus on more quicker chases, slugging and hooking can go in tandem, but it's not as advantageous as other killers. Like most of the M1 killers, Freddy showed improvement in the kill rate for the matches, and Wes noted the lack of downtime being more beneficial for the killer, as he was able to keep track of survivors in the Dream Realm and not having to worry about some of the more beefier second chance perks that pose issues for M1 killers overall. His hooking matches after the fact were noticeably more frustrating, citing gen rushing also being an issue as the amount of gen perks that are available have been nerfed and not providing as much synergy or preference with the killer's power. However, Wes did note that he felt bad for the survivors on the ground as some bled out due to the nature of the experiment. One of the biggest upsets with our Bubba was how effective the slugging playstyle was compared to the hooking one, especially on maps that were notably more survivor-sided, like Mother's Dwelling and Greenville. Bubba was able to focus more on chases with slugging rather than hooking, and Epi was happy that he didn't have to break off chases to focus on gen pressure. When he got to the hooking matches, he noted his frustration with survivors that got unhooked taking chase and trying to force their perks, while those who were unhooked hid for fear of being chased. It ended up having to lead into a more tunneling and camping playstyle, which he didn't want to go for, instead preferring to just slug and trace around the map instead. Per Epi, honestly, slugging is super effective, but it shouldn't be. Survivors are in a very strong spot right now, but the issue is that survivors are not good enough at the game to make the strength useful a lot of the time. With her recent hatchet buffs, Huntress was a complete natural at slugging, and the biggest frustration from the slugging games came from hatchets being dedicated on the server rather than survivors being able to counter it. Slugging games came with an overall improvement, and the playstyle was mentioned as being the best if they ever decided to go for win streaks because of how effective the games were. Huntress gets punished more so than others because of the lack of mobility, and if you accidentally tunnel, you pay the price immensely. Slugging on Huntress meant overall shorter chases with good snowball potential, and with precise hits made altruism near impossible. Despite this, Huntress is also a killer that it is notably near impossible impossible to unhook in front of, especially in basement situations, but when it came to slugging, she was a beast at it. Because you can't heal when you're in tier 3, the combination of anti-healing perks and uncoordinated survivors meant that Doctor was an excellent slugger and is able to really shine in this experiment. Doctor's built-in tracking also helps with the ability to snowball survivors trying to be altruistic in the surrounding area. Slugging for Doctor is definitely stronger than intended against the average player, and even more experienced Swifts because of the information and extra time you gain with his madness. Despite being an M1 killer, he's able to shut down chases effectively as well, shining high above some of his other counterparts with the time saving. As one of the few trap killers in the game, Hag excels at pressuring survivors stuck in her web, rather than being able to take advantage of a slugged situation. The slug's ability to crawl away from her area of control meant that they got picked up, and because of her slow chase speed and lack of ranged ability to make up for it, it meant that the games were overall more difficult than if she'd been able to pressure the survivors going for unhooks. Slugging people in an area that you have set up is incredibly easy for Hag, but in general, getting one person on the hook and then punishing altruism that way seems to be more preferred and an overall better playstyle. She still punishes altruism, but since she has to rely on big brain thinking and her web, it doesn't make much sense to slug as much as the experiment required. Myers is another killer that is along the lines of an opportunistic slugger, but his downfall is that he only has so many times that he can pop his tier 3 if he's not bringing infinite. Because he needs to focus on getting people out of the game as effectively as possible, slugging wasn't necessarily the most beneficial since he has his insta-down ability to help with the resets. But he is undeniably good at slugging. Myers' mobility is average, meaning that he'd have to stick around the slugged area if he wanted to punish altruism, but the ability to stalk survivors might be wasted if everyone was injured, denying a good chunk of his power. Despite the win rate being a bit higher, the salt rate wasn't worth the playstyle advantages, and Myers is definitely best left to slug and burst when the moment arises rather than going for it on purpose. As the best killer in the game, honestly there isn't much to say because once you're good at Nurse, slug or not, you'll end up winning the majority of your games. The win rate on Nurse was lower because most of ALF survivors ended up just trying to camp or bait for hatch, resulting in a lot of 3Ks as the majority of his games also resulted in no gens being completed. Like Blight, do or do not, you'll win. Alf, in his words, is a piece of shit who has slugged for years and will continue to do so because it's stupid easy on Nurse, and is also much easier to take advantage of than other killers. Another S tier killer, there was slight improvement to the gameplay with slugging that resulted in overall less gens being completed because survivors were so focused on altruism and trying to reset against the chainsaw. Slugging games were a bit more overstimulating for the killer, and oftentimes it felt like matches were wasted after resets when you don't have any hook states to showcase the progress. But when the hooking matches started, DS and other second chance perks were immediately noticed and weaponized against Billy, with survivors essentially throwing themselves at the killer in order to use their perks. Stan was content to keep survivors on the ground because of the nature of Billy, the perks used, and the fact that less gens were getting done, but it does make the matches feel more claustrophobic since the play area can be smaller than normal. With Wraith, slugging was overall much easier, and it kept track of survivors' positioning and game sense in short term. Swifts were noted as an issue as the coordination led being able to take advantage of Wraith, and the repetitive gameplay that Wraith also experiences in a day-to-day made Seven wish that the survivors were just out of the game, rather than continuously slugging them. He noted the situational frustration for Wraith, where slugging was difficult against coordinated teams, but hooking matches were difficult because of Sabo squads and survivors weaponizing their second chance perks. The slugging matches against not-so-coordinated teams made matches overall much quicker than normal, with less than one gen being completed on average. Slugging gameplay is all about balance, according to Seven, where slugging is more advantageous in most situations, especially when you don't have to worry about the time sink to hooking or having your progress ruined by saves. But there can be benefits to hooking since you're able to secure deaths that much easier. Finally, with the Trapper, hooking just seems to come more naturally for this killer, especially with the ability to shut down saves in most buildings and take advantage of the basement more so than other killers. As an M1 killer, there's no extra map mobility that came with his kit, and if survivors are not chasing in your setup, it can feel difficult to have the extra pressure you might need. If basement is available, it makes more sense to hook as Trapper than slug, but Trapper still makes saving a slug teammate dangerous since they are more often than not stuck in a trapped area. It made minute differences in gameplay, but like Hag, Trapper can definitely make hook saves more dangerous, requiring at times more than one survivor to go for it if the survivor is hooked in the wrong area. It wasn't necessarily the best gameplay, but it can work out in your favor depending on where the downed survivor is on the map. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching my video, and please try to be civil with discussion in any sort of social media post or comment section. I'm again not doing this for malicious reasons, but doing so out of curiosity for a viewpoint that I've noticed over the last few months. I'm incredibly thankful to everyone that participated in the experiment, as well as those who have helped me behind the scenes with consultation, data entry, and emotional support. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.